40-year-old Johnson was well known among Washington insiders when he entered the Senate, having lived in the Capitol for 15 out of the last 17 years. Carroll writes that Johnson made himself believe in his arguments, believe with absolute conviction through a process that was characteristically intense, involving LBJ talking about an issue and convincing himself it was right before getting all worked up and working all day and all night to sacrifice, and saying, "Follow me to the cause," as one acquaintance remembered. He was big all right, but he got bigger as he talked to you. Wingate Lucas remembered Johnson peeing in the parking lot of the House office building, admitting that he himself did it too, but that the rest of us would try to hide behind a car or something. Lyndon wouldn't. He just didn't care if someone noticed him. Carroll writes that Johnson would urinate in front of his secretaries. As a member of the House of Representatives, Johnson had a one-room hideaway office that lacked a toilet but had a wash basin concealed behind a wood and burlap screen. Carroll furthers, while entertaining guests in the hideaway or dictating to a secretary, he would pull the screen aside and urinate in the basin. Sometimes he would put the screen back before he did so, and sometimes he wouldn't. Dalek writes the most important thing to Johnson was being seen and heard, and that the new senator would do outlandish things to fix himself in people's memories, and if possible, intimidate them. Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia denounced the 70 Group Air Force as the Air Force Secretary's advertising slogan. Johnson then demanded an apology from Byrd for impugning the character, motives, and intelligence of 70 group supporters such as himself. Byrd said he had not meant to malign the motives of members of Congress. Johnson persisted in demanding an apology, or warned that he would take the matter up on the Senate floor. Byrd gave in, and Harlow remembers, he had faced down Harry Byrd. He hadn't been in the Senate long enough to warm his seat. That's Lyndon. No other senator could possibly have done it. No other senator could have gotten away with it. Johnson was well liked among his peers, equally at home with both segregationists, conservatives, and liberals. The effect of the 1948 campaign still lingered. Johnson even refused to comment on giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, a proposal that would eventually become law, on the basis of wanting to avoid controversial issues for the time being. The Johnson staff was young, with 14 of its 16 members being under 31 years of age, and including John Connally. Johnson had persuaded him to come to Washington to organize his office, and he joined Connally in putting the office on a 24-hour day that gave them the ability to respond fast and effectively to constituents. While Johnson always pressured his staff, Dalek writes that he was particularly intense in his first Senate years when he was trying to prove himself. Johnson persuaded federal agencies to spend money in Texas, thereafter issuing press releases tying his name to the accomplishment. As these instances could be limited, Johnson's office also released stories about the latter's concern for issues such as agricultural subsidies and veterans' rights. Johnson also established good relations with other Texas politicians, being eager to be of service whenever he could and telling Lieutenant Governor Allen Shivers, "I shall need the help of fellows like you to be the kind of a senator Texas deserves." Before entering the Senate, as the Stevenson controversy was underway, Johnson had requested a seat on the Appropriations Committee when speaking to Tom Connally. Johnson was given a seat on the Armed Services and Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committees. Dalek writes that Johnson avoided doctrinaire positions that would make him seem like a clone of the Southern Bloc. Truman outlined goals that included tax reform, repealing the Taft-Hartley Act, a minimum wage of 75 cents, expanding Social Security, increasing public power, national medical insurance, education, receiving federal aid, and housing and civil rights programs. The senators from the former 11 Confederate states organized a caucus and met to create a strategy to defeat both Truman's cloture proposal and civil rights program. Johnson and Estes Kefauver were the only two senators not to attend this meeting. When he delivered a speech on the Senate floor 2 days later, Johnson condemned the cloture motion and stated that he was opposed to civil rights legislation not because of any prejudice, but its methods, his argument earning him rebuke from civil rights supporters. The Houston NAACP secretary wired Johnson, "The Negroes who sent you to Congress are ashamed to know that you have stood on the floor against them today. Do not forget that you went to Washington by a small majority vote, and that was because of the Negro vote. There will be another election, and we will be remembering what you had to say today. By 1949, Hispanics made up nearly 20% of the Texas population, and Johnson was especially against offending them. Head of a veterans organization, Hector Garcia, told Johnson that the only funeral home in Three Rivers would not conduct the internment of Mexican-American soldier Felix Longoria, who died in the Second World War, in the town's all-white cemetery, incensed at the disrespect of a war hero and wanting to show his support for Hispanics. Johnson arranged for Longoria to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The move was blasted by some white Texans as a publicity stunt, and Johnson received good coverage on the front page of the New York Times and other publications for having the courage of his convictions. Dalek writes that although Johnson truly wanted the lives of black and Hispanic Texans to improve, he didn't see the path to this advance, however, through civil rights laws. The senator instead favored a frontal assault on the ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-fed problem facing America. Johnson believed federal spending on defense and agriculture alongside housing, education, and healthcare programs for Southerners would increase the South's prosperity and narrow the gap between it and the national standard by the largest margin since the Civil War. He also believed civil rights advances would come from these improvements. Economist Gavin Wright later writing that the South's fundamental economic changes were a prelude to the civil rights revolution in the 1950s and 1960s. Although opposed to the president's civil rights proposals, Johnson favored many of his other reforms, backing the administration on votes to extend rent control, the first significant aid to education bill, raising the minimum wage, and expanding Social Security benefits. Johnson voted with conservatives when Taft-Hartley revisions were proposed, Johnson sharing Rayburn's view and recognizing the rapacious bunch of people the big oil companies were, but feeling compelled to represent their interests as their senator. Harry McPherson said that while Johnson was never a friend of the oil and gas industry, backing them was a fact of life for any Texas senator. You simply could not oppose that and stay alive as a political figure in Texas. Dalek writes that reduction of the 27.5% depletion allowance to oil producers on their taxes, federal versus state ownership of tidelands, and natural gas production deregulation were the three oil and gas issues under consideration during Johnson's first term. Though the White House saw the 27.5% as excessive, a lack of congressional support for tax reform led the deletion allowance to remain in effect for years. The issue of tidelands or offshore oil was much more controversial. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had paramount rights to the submerged lands by California. State officials in Texas thought they had a stronger case for claims to its tidelands than California, citing Texas having previously been a sovereign nation before admittance to the Union, and the Land Commissioner of Texas urging the state to secede from the Union rather than have its land be surrendered. These calls increased after the Supreme Court also ruled against Texas. Johnson privately favored federal control of the submerged lands, but publicly supported sentiments in his state. In 1951 and 1952, Johnson helped pass bills that granted almost every state control over 3 miles of offshore lands and gave special consideration to Texas, granting it 10.5 miles due to its special history. Truman vetoed the bills and dubbed them robbery in broad daylight. Before 1945, natural gas had been an unimportant resource, rising to become an alternative to coal for home heating after a war of pipelines between the Southwest and Northeast. The Federal Power Commission saw the 1938 Natural Gas Act as having no authority to regulate prices by independent producers or companies not described as utilities. The Supreme Court ruled that the FPC did have the authority to regulate gas sold in interstate commerce, and senators from gas-producing states reacted by urging the passage of legislation that would deny the FPC power to set prices for independent natural gas companies. Democratic Senator Robert Kerr made deregulation his priority, Kerr having a large personal interest in passing such legislation as the owner of $100 million in natural gas reserves. He acknowledged this personal stake in deregulation. Dalek describes Johnson as becoming Kerr's strong right arm in the fight. Johnson chaired the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Subcommittee, reporting on the bill and urged oil and gas lobbyists to get the word out on his role in fighting for the law. Johnson also argued against critics who said the deregulation would lead to higher gas prices and bigger producer profits. Johnson and Kerr eventually convincing 42 other senators to vote for the bill and 14 others to be absent. The bill passed in March 1950 by a margin of 44 to 38. Truman requested the reconfirmation of Leland Olds to the Federal Power Commission. Johnson found opposing Olds appealing on several counts. Olds' lack of popularity with Texas oil and gas interests who saw him as an unmitigated foe who would give the FPC an anti-industry and anti-Texas majority for several years. Olds not being on the FPC would benefit Brown and Root as the company's share of Texas Eastern Transmission made them interested in oil and gas. The reappointment was very disliked by senators and could likely be defeated. Finally, as a result of his radical background, Olds would be an attractive target for Johnson to align himself with the conservative swing in his state. In his capacity as chair of an Interstate and Commerce Subcommittee, Johnson allowed witnesses to hit Olds with affiliations and ideas going back 20 and 30 years. His role in the Olds attack angered liberal friends, with Joseph L. Ross saying that Johnson's handling of the Olds nomination was a pre-Joseph McCarthy campaign. Really vicious. That was one of the dirtiest pieces of work ever done. Dalek writes that Johnson's attack on Olds helped him to shed his reputation as a staunch New Dealer, establish himself as an uncompromising defender of Texas interests, and align himself with the conservative political mood in the state. Dalek notes that other Johnson biographers claim that as soon as he took his seat, he tried to distinguish the whales from the minnows, the power brokers from the ordinary Senate members, and to cultivate the most important leaders like Richard Russell. Dalek furthers that although Johnson unquestionably made conscious efforts to learn about and establish himself in the good graces of Senate leaders, his principal goal in 1949 was not to become majority leader, but to ensure his reelection by making himself a highly regarded Texan, Southwestern, and nationally minded senator. Russell was an important figure to Johnson, though Dalek observes that more than power considerations attracted Johnson. There was much about Russell that Johnson genuinely admired. Russell had been the youngest governor in Georgia's history and had been in the Senate since 1932 with a legendary knowledge of American history and politics. Though seen as a conservative, Russell had helped create the Rural Electrification Administration and the Farmers' Home Administration. Though Russell was more committed to segregation than Johnson, they both were opponents of federal activism on behalf of civil rights in the early 50s and partnered for the fuller integrating of the South and West into the economic and political life of America, sharing a desire for both regions to gain bigger shares of the national wealth and power than they had controlled before. By November 1949, 11 months into Johnson's term, the pair had become so close that Russell spent part of Thanksgiving with LBJ in Texas. Johnson also formed a friendship with Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. The civil rights advocate had alienated many Southern senators with his call for civil rights at the 1948 Democratic National Convention. Spending about a year in an apprenticeship of isolation until getting to know LBJ, who he credited with changing his role in the Senate. After having lunch in the Senate dining room, Johnson invited Humphrey to his office for discussion on legislation and the Senate over a drink. These conversations, where they were usually joined by someone else, changed Humphrey's reputation to that of a more pragmatic fellow, and Humphrey saw Johnson as a pragmatic moderate and felt he was a lot more liberal than he ever acted. Despite opposition to some of its proposals, he maintained good relations with the White House, forming a relationship with White House counsel Clark Clifford. Communist North Korea attacked the 38th parallel that separated it from the American-backed Republic of South Korea. Truman, believing the attack was a representation of a challenge to the free world, similar to Germany's aggression towards Czechoslovakia in 1938, was convinced Western security and the collective security principle embodied in the United Nations needed a firm response. Truman announced his intent to meet force with force and was praised by both conservatives and liberals alike. Johnson hailed Truman's action. The president's decision was courageous and essential, and I support it. History may prove that this was the turning point of the Cold War. The world has expected the United States to lead the free nations unafraid and unbellied. Now we are showing that we mean what we say. Dalek writes that the Korean War presented Johnson with the opportunities of getting a chance to press Americans to recognize what he believed were terrible dangers facing America and open a way for him to have a larger role in national affairs that would make it harder for him to lose his Senate seat. Within 2 weeks of Truman's announcement, Johnson delivered a Senate speech calling for the use of all of the National Guard and the reserve units and the full mobilization of the U.S. industrial capacity. Johnson furthered that they were in the midst of a grave national emergency and that there was at least a strong possibility that we may be approaching World War III. Johnson wished to chair a watchdog committee like the one Truman had presided over during the Second World War. Truman opposed Johnson's subcommittee and the one under Emanuel Seller in the House, saying that while his own committee was formed to meet emergencies for military construction in America, the current conflict was an entirely different situation. When Johnson met privately with Truman, he pointed out that his committee would forestall the Government Operations Committee from investigating the war effort. Truman approved the subcommittee statements. Dalek writes that Johnson's direction of the subcommittee during the next 5 months won him national approval and projected him into the forefront of the Democratic Party. Between August and January, the subcommittee produced 4 of what would eventually be 44 reports that criticized the paperwork, preparedness, and business-as-usual attitude of the Truman administration and federal agencies, as well as lambasting the Government Munitions Board for selling surplus property to industry while failing to make effective plans on stockpiling enough rubber, nickel, tin, and wool. These reports received support from the 7 subcommittee members and widespread national praise. Senator Styles Bridges remembered that Johnson never tried to whitewash the administration. Columnist Arthur Knock of the New York Times, other newspapers, and magazines praised Johnson, the subcommittee, and its staff. Dalek writes that LBJ was no less mindful of the political gains and losses that could be had from the war crisis, and that the committee was a vehicle for advancing not only the war effort, but also his political ambition. In the 1950 midterm election, the Democrats lost 28 seats in the House and 5 in the Senate. This resulted in the Democratic Party majority shrinking from a 12-seat advantage to just 2, and notably, Congressman Richard Nixon won an open seat in the House after labeling Congresswoman Helen Gagan Douglas the Pink Lady. Robert Kerr initially supported New Mexico Senator Clinton Anderson for the whip position, but switched to Johnson after Anderson showed no interest. Russell backed Johnson as he believed the energetic senator would contrast well with the laid-back McFarland, and according to George Reedy, Russell realized that Johnson would work much harder simply because it could be regarded as an achievement. He had very correctly gauged Johnson as the kind of a man who would work his head off if he was presented with a new challenge. On January 2, 1951, Johnson became the youngest whip in the history of the Democratic Party. Dalek writes that Johnson had moved quickly to establish himself in the front rank of his colleagues during his first 2 years in the Senate as part of a strategy to win a second term in 1954, and that he expected his national and party prominence to erase the shadow of his 87-vote victory in 1948 and make him a shoo-in for another term. Johnson's election as majority whip encouraged Washington insiders to see him as a rising star in the Democratic Party. Dalek writes that Johnson had 2 minds about being party whip, doubting its worth as a result of the position being little more than the front man for the party's power brokers, who collected information for the party leader on the incoming votes of Democratic senators, and the whip having to spend more time in Washington away from constituents than other senators, contributing to former whip Francis Meyer's loss. In August 1950, Russell requested Johnson's subcommittee draft a law covering both draft revision and UMT following hearings on these subjects being suspended in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Despite the bill being loaded with controversial issues, Johnson was able to get the bill passed in the Senate with only 5 votes against it. Although Johnson was right by the president as he signed the act into law, the bill was watered down from its original form, with the draft age lowered to 18 and a half, a service extension term to 24 months, and UMT only becoming a reality after a national commission had conceived a more detailed work plan. Johnson's subcommittee released a report claiming there were 6 Navy and Marine Corps training centers where men were being misused in the performance of minor duties, and the subcommittee shifted its attention to air power in 1952. In March 1952, after the Truman administration announced another air power goal postponement, Johnson stated his intent to conduct a full review of American air forces with an emphasis on comparing the air production and quality of aircraft between the U.S. and Soviets. His subcommittee conducted their most extensive inquiry and received testimony from high-ranking American officials that the most serious possible danger to the United States from Soviet air would likely occur in 1954. The administration remained content with achieving full Air Force readiness in 1955, and the Johnson subcommittee cited the air power program as abuse, misuse, and disuse of power. Dalek writes that although LBJ's concerns were exaggerated and his solutions now seem unthinkable, they also reflected what most Americans and government officials believed at the time, pointing to a series of Gallup polls that showed 81% of Americans viewing Russia as trying to build herself up to be the ruling power of the world, and 55% believing that the Korean War meant the U.S. was already in World War III. Dalek writes that Johnson did not relish an unwinnable war with the Soviet Union and China that would leave all the belligerents devastated by atomic bombs, siding with Truman when he dismissed General MacArthur for publicly challenging the administration's policy to limit the war to Korea. Public sympathy for MacArthur was rampant, the latter receiving 500,000 people cheering his return to the United States and an estimated 7.5 million people turning out to see him during his visit to New York. Although Johnson regretted MacArthur's withdrawal, he believed the issue was whether American policy shall be made by the elected officials of the government who are responsible to the people, or by military leaders who are responsible only to their immediate superiors. This view was not popular with most Texans, with the Senate post office receiving its largest flow of mail in history in the days after MacArthur's dismissal. Immediately after MacArthur's dismissal, Republicans in Congress called for an investigation into the Truman administration's military and foreign policy and an opportunity for the general to present his views. Johnson played a part in the hearings, lending his aides George Reedy and Gerald Siegel to the Joint Committee for the laborious staff work of the investigation. Johnson exposed MacArthur's questionable ideas during the hearings, with the journalist saying that Johnson tried to get the general to admit that he didn't know too much about our responsibilities in Europe and cared less, and had no opinion on UMT. Johnson offered no judgment on the dispute in his public statements on the hearings, allowing people to draw their own conclusions about MacArthur's beliefs. Dalek writes that the MacArthur hearings were partially an object lesson in the politics of foreign policy, and that the Democrats had a hidden agenda to undermine MacArthur's hold in the public imagination, furthering that LBJ learned from the hearings that public leaders accepted the necessity of manipulating public opinion for the sake of a good foreign policy and the advantage of their party. Despite the perceptions of Johnson as a conservative convert, he still remained liberal on selective measures. The Truman administration created the Civil Defense Administration, and head of the Office of Minority Affairs, Mary McLeod Bethune, saw a chance for the work of the NYA to be repeated in helping disadvantaged blacks, reaching out to Johnson for help. Tommy Corcoran and Jim Rowe called LBJ the following month to inform him of the Texas oil interest appointing one of their people to lead the natural gas section of the Interior Department, but they had succeeded in preventing it. Johnson also supported increased federal assistance for the aged, blind, and disabled under Social Security, funding for vocational education, flood control, and soil reclamation, backed price, wage, and rent controls, and excluding programs from a 5% cut on federal domestic programs. In fall 1951, Executive Secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Walter White, attended a meeting of the Texas NAACP in Austin, noting the grievous disappointment of Johnson's lining up with the Dixiecrats against civil rights, and spoke of this making it imperative that by 1952, the Negro registered vote in Texas be raised as close as possible in its full potential of 600,000. Dalek writes that thanks to LBJ's pro-oil and anti-civil rights stands, hard-line anti-communism, and rise to prominence in the Senate in only 4 years, he became a likely shoo-in for a second term. Despite this, the first-term senator refused to take any chances, especially at a time when scandals in the Truman administration and communist witch hunting were destroying careers. He was also troubled by the sudden death of Alvin Wirtz, his 63-year-old friend's demise, reminding Johnson of his own family's history of both heart disease and strokes. Walter Jenkins, remembering the vacuum left in LBJ's life by Wirtz's death, said, "He depended on Senator Wirtz, I think, more than anybody in his life for real sage advice, counsel. Mr. Johnson leaned on him till the end." Dalek writes that Lady Bird was the greatest anchor in LBJ's life who provided him with a kind of sanctuary from himself, a well-organized household where her calm balanced his volatility. In 1951, LBJ bought a Pedernals property between the High and Stonewall communities near where he had lived as a child. Johnson's need for a ranch was to demonstrate his roots in Texas and entertain guests in a style that was more of a mark of status among Texas millionaires and many senators who also had a ranch or spread where they could either retreat on vacation or throw lavish parties. The Johnsons were enthusiastic about the possible financial gains from acquiring an FCC license to construct the only very high-frequency television station in Austin. The FCC had only allocated 106 television stations for the whole country and declared a moratorium on issuing new licenses to launch a 4-year study on the locations and number of stations that should be constructed across America. Dalek writes that it is not surprising that few traces of Johnson's actions at the FCC showed up in the commission's files. Quoting attorney W. Aaron James, Johnson learned early, when he was a young congressman, you don't go down and ask Harold Ikes, the Secretary of the Interior, to do something. You reach over in the Bureau of Indian Affairs or the Forest Service or whatever, National Park Service, one of the bureaus of the Interior Department, and you find some guy in there who is a bright guy that knows what the hell he's doing, and you talk to him about getting it done. You start it from that way and not fool with these people at the top. Old friend Arthur Stelling came to Johnson for help on getting a license for radio station KNAF in Fredericksburg, with Johnson recommending that he push the application through the commission. This worked as the FCC granted Stelling a license. Johnson made sure KTBC-TV enjoyed a monopoly on television broadcasting, with Austin only receiving one station, whereas the Dallas-Fort Worth area had 5 VHF stations and Houston and San Antonio had 4. Asked if the FCC was politicized, John Conley answered, "Oh yes, no question. The Federal Communications Commission would deny there was any politics to it, but nevertheless, he was fortunate in that the FCC designed the coverage areas to where Austin just happened to be without competition in the profitable band of television in those days." Johnson expanded the holdings of Texas Broadcasting to other Texas cities besides Austin and launched a campaign to win part ownership of the only VHF channel in Waco. Dalek writes, in advancing his business interests, Johnson was doing what came naturally to most aggressive entrepreneurs. His principal vocation as a high-ranking elected official and his use of that office to serve his private interests, however, made some, if not most, of his business dealings improper. He had no illusions about what he was doing, as his efforts to hide his close involvements with the radio and television properties demonstrate. But enduring anxieties about losing his office allowed him to rationalize his actions. The possibility that his livelihood might one day depend exclusively on the radio and television stations were never far from his mind, and the fear that this could happen in 1954 remained very much a concern throughout 1951 to 52. Johnson worried of being challenged by Texas Governor Allen Shivers. Johnson tried to be the intermediary between Shivers and Rayburn, the latter viewing Shivers as more like a Republican than Democrat and persuading Ralph Yarborough to run for governor against Shivers. At the 1952 Democratic National Convention, Johnson arranged a meeting between Shivers and Rayburn, where Shivers promised to support the convention's nominees in the event his delegates were seated. As Truman decided against running for another term, Johnson and Shivers were united in their support for Richard Russell's presidential campaign. Russell had promised Johnson he would back him for the vice presidential candidate if he did not receive the nomination, as he was seen as too sectional of a candidate to get a national following. Russell did poorly in the primaries, running third to Estes Kuffofer and Governor Adlai Stevenson. Johnson was never up for consideration as the vice presidential candidate, with eventual winner Adlai Stevenson choosing Alabama Senator John Sparkman, and Rayburn, who attended the meeting on the decision for a running mate, reporting that LBJ wasn't even mentioned. Although Johnson supported Stevenson for president, the latter's lack of popularity made his endorsement lack enthusiastic support. Johnson declared his support for the Democratic ticket on August 28th, following this up with urging Richard Russell to make some public showing of support for the Stevenson-Sparkman ticket. The ticket lost to General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Senator Richard Nixon. Wanting to heighten his appeal to Texas voters, Johnson told Booth Mooney that about half the voters of Texas were against him and that he needed to make a dent before his reelection. In the 2 months between the 1952 election and the day Senate Democrats met to elect their leaders, Johnson devoted himself to winning the leadership position by the largest possible margin. Dalek writes that the exact sequence of events by which Johnson brought Russell and other senators to his side is difficult to reconstruct, but that it was certain Johnson himself masterminded the campaign. Most of the Southerners were ready to follow Russell's lead, most certainly after Bobby Baker warned them Humphrey might get the job if LBJ did not. Johnson, wanting to start his tenure as leader with the greatest possible party harmony, proposed to Humphrey that the latter become minority whip. While exhilarated by this proposal, Humphrey was more interested in better committee assignments and more liberals on committees. In a speech, Russell nominated Johnson to become the youngest leader in the history of the Democratic Party, pointing to LBJ's record of party loyalty, as well as his human values, peerless qualities as a consolator, and being a party unity champion. Johnson abided by Humphrey's wishes for liberal representation on the steering committee and the Senate Finance, Judiciary, Commerce, and Appropriations committees, and told Humphrey that the latter would be the representative of liberals who they would need to speak to in order to relay a message to Johnson. Johnson grew to be jealous of Majority Leader Robert Taft due to the latter having more national prominence and attention than himself. When journalists that he courted decided to give Taft more newsprint, Johnson would call them pissant reporters. Dalek writes that Johnson saw his position as minority leader as carrying responsibilities he welcomed, and that LBJ mapped a strategy that could restore Democratic control of Congress and serve the well-being of the country. George Reedy wrote a memo that Johnson widely distributed urging the Democrats to vote as a unified party as much as possible and cooperate with Eisenhower, who he believed would be in greater agreement with Senate Democrats than Senate Republicans. And the outcome of Republican infighting would be simultaneous with Democrats having a strong record on soil conservation, power, and housing that they could use for campaign ammunition in the 1954 and 1956 elections. Rayburn, now the minority leader in the House, echoed this approach, telling Eisenhower that he would work with him on international affairs and defense if he could get his party on board, and was willing to assist with extending any existing Democratic program. Johnson agreed with the Reedy-Rayburn approach, having seen Eisenhower's 1952 victory as a chance to convert the fractionalized Democratic Senate group into a cohesive whole. Johnson turned the Senate Democratic Policy Committee into a unified voice on legislation, broadening the committee's composition to consist of 4 conservatives, 2 moderates, and 3 liberals, with an agreement that 90% of the committee members had to support legislative recommendations. Johnson, believing that party harmony partially depended on changing traditions, switched the primary function of the Senate Democratic Steering Committee from focusing on seniority to appoint 3 liberals and 3 conservatives to the 6 vacant spots. Richard Russell backed Johnson's reforms, believing they would both restore Democratic control over Congress and advance LBJ's prospects for the presidency. George Reedy remembered Russell made no bones whatsoever. He was quite open with me that he thought the only way to ever really put an end to the Civil War was to elect a Southerner president, and he could not see any Southerner that could get elected president except LBJ. He talked about that to me as early as 1953. Johnson promoted unity through what Dallek calls muting ideological differences between liberals and conservatives, appointing Hubert Humphrey to the Foreign Relations Committee as to prevent him from getting involved in domestic issues that were divisive among Senate Democrats. Wayne Morse's defection meant a 48-48 tie that Vice President Nixon could break. Johnson refused to let Morse join the Democratic Party, believing he would replace a deserving Democrat on the Armed Services and Labor Committees. Johnson deferred letting Morse sit on the Democratic side of the aisle to the Rules Committee, which rejected Morse's request, and the independent senator told Paul Douglas of his intent to campaign against Johnson in Texas the following year. Columnist Drew Pearson attacked Johnson for having betrayed the Democratic Party and charged him with corruption. Pearson had previously asked Johnson to help prevent Joseph McCarthy from attacking him as a communist. Pearson accused Johnson of making a deal with Taft to throw out a Democratic vote to the Republicans each time Morse voted with the Democrats, and charged Johnson with suppressing Preparedness Subcommittee reporters on General Motors for defense contract profits and the New Jersey waterfront's crimes, which had cost the American government much money, also claiming LBJ had fired 2 investigators who reported the waterfront racketeering to him. The charges enraged Johnson, who said Pearson was blackmailing him, and the controversy died out quickly despite causing Johnson considerable discomfort. In Eisenhower's State of the Union message, he called for bipartisanship, and in a private meeting later that month cited the need for this to happen as soon as possible. Although Eisenhower hammered Democrats for the secret agreements at Yalta that permitted Soviet enslavement of Eastern Europe, his resolution to the Hill only critiqued the Soviet Union for its interpretation of Yalta instead of the Roosevelt administration. Joseph McCarthy led isolationist Republicans to attack Eisenhower for not repudiating the agreements and called for an amendment to his statement. As it became clear that Republicans would not back down, LBJ had the Democrats support the president's foreign policy, the Democratic Policy Committee commending Eisenhower's resolution for containing no trace of partisanship that could lead to discord and disunity on February 24th. Eisenhower nominated Charles Bolin to be Soviet Union ambassador. Due to Bolin's association with FDR in helping draft the Yalta agreements, he earned McCarthy's wrath, who purported that FBI files would prove he was unqualified. Taft and John Sparkman examined the file, finding nothing damaging, and Johnson defended Bolin on the Senate floor by equating opposition to Bolin as questioning the integrity of Eisenhower, Taft, and Sparkman. Bolin was approved by the Senate in a vote of 74-13. Republican Senator John Bricker offered an amendment that would urge limits on executive authority to make treaties to prevent more Yaltas, and said that it should depend on Congress to pass legislation to make executive and other agreements into laws. Johnson publicly supported the bill but privately said, "It's the worst bill I can think of. It ties the president's hands, and I'm not just talking about Ike. It will be the bane of every president we elect. We've got to stop the damn thing, and I think we can." The White House tied up the amendment in hearings, though Bricker and supporters pushed the amendment through the Judiciary Committee. Eisenhower and Johnson arranged all 3 proposals to be defeated, Johnson having arranged Walter George to offer a resolution that narrowly failed to win a 2/3 majority. Carroll writes, Johnson had hit, in fact, every target at which he had aimed in the battle, wanting to show the public a hero president unparalleled in his knowledge of foreign affairs, being opposed in foreign affairs by his own party, and being rescued from that party by the Democrats. He had succeeded in doing exactly that, wanting to demonstrate that despite GOP control of both White House and Senate, the Democrats had taken the initiative on the issue. He had, by arranging for the final vote to be not on a Republican but on a Democratic bill, done exactly that. He had wanted the Bricker Amendment defeated, and it had been defeated. He had wanted the George Amendment defeated, and it had been substituted. He had wanted the George Amendment blocked at last, and at last it had been blocked. Johnson turned Eisenhower's bills into laws resembling the New Deal with amendments from the Democratic Policy Committee. Reedy furthered, it also meant that the Senate Democrats were pitted solely against amendments. The picture before the public was that of a Republican president and a Democratic Senate cooperating in the service of the nation, while a small group of GOP partisans were trying to throw sand in the gears. Johnson publicly emphasized the Democrats as the real friends of President Eisenhower on domestic legislation, describing the bills passed as extensions of the New Deal Fair Deal measures. This included the extension of the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, granting authority to reorganize executive agencies as done under Democratic predecessors, and an excessive profits tax, which furthered an existing law with a 6-month extension. Al Gore Sr., father of future U.S. Vice President Al Gore, praised Johnson for having unified the Democratic Party in the U.S. Senate as I have not seen it unified in 15 years. Johnson and Reedy believe multiple Democrats were aiming to run against Johnson in 1954, with Reedy commenting, "You had more people getting set to run against Lyndon Johnson for the Senate than you had voters in the average Texas precinct." Johnson's office never resisted in polishing his image, Johnson being featured on the cover of Time magazine in June and described as a potential presidential nominee in 1956. Johnson remarked, "I'm not smart enough to make a president. I come from the wrong part of the country. I like the Senate job. I want to stay there." Johnson wanted to win re-election in a landslide and discourage any serious challenger to him in 1954, deciding to embark on a 2.5-month tour of the state where he gave between 13 and 17 speeches a day and shook over 200,000 hands. George Reedy remembered the tour as absolutely breathtaking and said that by the end of it, nobody wanted to run against him. Johnson privately worried about liberal attacks on his leadership that could divide and undermine the party ahead of the 1954 congressional elections. An editorial in the Courier Journal noted Johnson winning 2 Senate votes in January through unifying Southerners and Republicans against most Democrats, charging LBJ with dividing Democrats and with the division creating amounts practically in repudiation. Joseph McCarthy charged the Democrats with being guilty of 20 years of treason, causing Johnson to charge the Republicans with issuing irresponsible statements that might endanger party unity, and Eisenhower requesting that they cease this behavior. Johnson avoided critiquing McCarthy due to the latter's high favorability at the time, and instead attacked the Republican farm program that would reduce payments and return to a free agriculture market, calling the program a bold, dynamic, forward-looking retreat for falling prices. Southern and Northern Democrats differed on bringing the multiracial islands of Hawaii into the Union, with Johnson supporting Commonwealth status and having that motion fail 60-42. Johnson then attacked Nolan and Republicans for scheduling a Senate night session on the matter and turned the attention from statehood to the prerogatives of the Democratic minority, uniting 46 Democrats, Republican William Langer and Wayne Morse to win adjournment in a vote of 48-45. Johnson distinguished himself from other Southern politicians who, in the wake of the Brown decision, which ruled that segregation in public school was unconstitutional, appeased constituents with segregationist rhetoric. Although 3 out of every 4 adults in Texas disapproved of the court's decision, Johnson said, "However we may question the judgment of the men who made this ruling, it cannot be overruled now, and it is probable that it could never be overruled." Dalek writes that LBJ hoped the South would find constructive ways to accommodate itself to the court's action, and believed that in the long run, Southern acceptance of desegregation was essential to the region's economic advance. Johnson introduced a resolution endorsing the Eisenhower administration's view of the communists seeking to create a beachhead in the Americas, the Atomic Energy Revision Act, which demonstrated administration opposition to public power projects in general and supported atomic research by private corporations financed by the federal government, represented the biggest challenge to Johnson's aims of promoting party unity and bipartisanship. Johnson supported Southern Democrats and Republicans in voting to end the filibuster, and after a conference committee saw the liberal amendments removed, Johnson aided in restoring them to the bill. Senator Wayne Morse spoke to the liberal Americans for Democratic Action in Austin, praising FDR for 5 minutes, before noting that Johnson had the most reactionary record in the Senate. If he should ever have a liberal idea, he would have a brain hemorrhage. The Morse attack aroused sympathy for Johnson. In February 1954, a confidential survey found that whereas Johnson had a 60% approval rating in Texas in November to December 1953, now it was only 47%. This encouraged state legislator Dudley T. Dougherty to run against him, believing that only a campaign with McCarthyism tactics could allow an unknown to defeat Johnson in 1954. Johnson's strategy of campaigning against Dougherty included issuing a report from Washington that described his efforts to serve Texas and circulating a letter that he would not campaign in Texas during the spring and summer to instead attend to important matters in Congress. Dougherty attacked Johnson as being soft on communism, having enriched himself in office, being a messenger boy for Brown and Root, and deserving jail for breaking campaign spending laws. Johnson requested information on Dougherty from the FBI, which the former used to prevent Dougherty from publishing a last-minute attack on him. In the election, Johnson received 529,000 more votes than Dougherty, winning 883,000 to 354,000 with 71.3% of the vote. Dowlick writes that Johnson's one-sided victory led him to be less attentive to the conservative impulses dominating Texas politics, and that the party leader had been under pressure to do something about Wisconsin Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy. LBJ's friend Arthur Stelling was introduced to McCarthy in Washington, and over dinner the latter learned of his friendship with Johnson, asking him how the senator made his money, how he treated his staff, and if he cheated on his wife. Stelling reported this to Johnson, who saw this as a sign McCarthy intended to target him. As Hubert Humphrey remembered, Lyndon kept saying that we had to wait until McCarthy began attacking the more conservative, the respected, the senators of what you might call the old school. Johnson saw the beginnings of McCarthy's fall in 1952 and 1953 during the latter's clashes with Senators Carl Hayden and Harry Byrd. After McCarthy aide Matthews attacked the Protestant clergy and Methodist Bishop of Washington, D.C., G. Bromley Oxnam, and angered his friend Senator Byrd, Johnson called the attack a fatal mistake for McCarthy. The latter would see his demise begin in 1954. In February of that year, McCarthy told Brigadier General Ralph W. Swicker that he was not fit to wear that uniform and lacking the brains of a 5-year-old child. Secretary of the Army Robert Stevens condemned this characterization, leading McCarthy to state his intent to kick the brains out of anyone who protects communists. Stevens was later tricked by McCarthy into signing a statement with the fine print stipulating that Swicker testify again and give McCarthy names of everyone involved in both the promotion and discharge of the Camp Clymer dentist. Stevens and the Eisenhower administration responded by releasing charges against McCarthy and his aide Roy Cohn. McCarthy accused the Army of trying to blackmail him for his anti-communist stances, and Carl Mundent was named to chair the investigation of charges by and against McCarthy. Johnson viewed daily public exposure as key to undermining McCarthy's credibility, urging fellow Democratic Senator John McClellan to insist on televising the proceedings. Believing that newspapers and 2 minutes a night on television were not enough to cripple McCarthy, Johnson requested Wall Street attorney Ed Wiesel to coerce his client, chairman of the American Broadcasting Company, Leonard Goldenson, to televise the hearings. In the period of April to June 1954, McCarthy performed before millions of television viewers using doctored photos, phony FBI reports, and memoranda taken from the Pentagon files to dispute charges against himself. But his appearance, combined with the evidence of his underhanded tactics, worked in defeating him. Vermont Republican Ralph Flanders introduced a motion to remove McCarthy from his chairmanships, the latter being confident the Senate would not support such an assault on its seniority system. Johnson persuaded his colleagues against having the Democratic Policy Committee take a stand, believing this would help McCarthy get back into the good graces of other Republicans. The Senate voted on August 2nd to appoint a special committee of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans to recommend a response to the Flanders resolution. In the months leading up to the Flanders resolution, Johnson dispatched Bobby Baker to speak to important senators on using this procedure to condemn McCarthy. Baker remembered also communicating with Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren and Eisenhower Congressional Liaison General Jerry Pearsons. Johnson wanted either Walter George or Russell on the Democratic side of the committee, but both declined serving. Democratic Senator from Colorado Ed Johnson relished the assignment, saying that if he could stick a knife in McCarthy, he'd put it in and twist it north, east, south, and west. 2 Southern Democrats, Mississippian John Stennis and North Carolinian Sam Ervin, agreed to be on the committee. 9 days of hearings in August and September led to the September 27th recommendation for McCarthy to be found guilty. Johnson condemned McCarthy's description of Republican Arthur V. Watkins as stupid and cowardly, saying, "The words used in describing these men do not belong in the pages of the congressional record. They would be more fitting inscribed on the wall of a men's room." Paul Douglas declared 30 years later, Johnson was splendid on McCarthy. He got every single Democrat, including Jim Eastland, to vote for not censure but disapproval of McCarthy, and combined with one half of the Republicans, that gave a 3/4 vote for censure of McCarthy and was the beginning of his downfall. Dalek writes that Johnson's principal objectives in the campaign had been to maintain Democratic unity, deny the Republicans exclusive identification with anti-communism, and refute suggestions that a Republican Congress would serve Eisenhower better than the Democratic one, and that Johnson had reduced the Republicans' ability to use anti-communism as a talking point by getting the Democrats to agree to not use McCarthy as a party issue. In the 1954 election, Nixon attacked the Democrats as hard as he could in June, blaming them for the loss of China, the Korean War, and cited the Atchison policy as the reason for the dangers in Indochina, furthering that the Democrats had not accurately considered the communist threat and covered up its infiltration into their government. While Stevenson and Rayburn publicly responded to Nixon, Johnson privately called the vice president a fascist. Johnson's main effort in the campaign was going on a 10-day speaking tour of 8 Western states to support candidates for the House, Senate, and gubernatorial elections. Johnson aided Joseph O. Mahoney in Wyoming and Jim Murray in Montana against charges of being weak on communism, saying, "They're trying to tell you there are nothing but a bunch of communists among the Democrats in Washington. I suppose they mean that good old red communist Harry Flood Byrd. Do you think that Walter George of Georgia is a communist? Do you think that Dick Russell is a communist? Or Big Ed Johnson?" The November election saw Democrats retake control of Congress, with the House Democrats gaining 17 seats, with the likelihood of Sam Rayburn becoming Speaker again, and the Democrats having a 1-seat majority over the Republicans in the Senate, with former Republican and now Independent Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon promising to vote with Democrats in exchange for a seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Johnson consented, and this 49-47 edge gave the 46-year-old Johnson enough votes to become the youngest Senate Majority Leader in Senate history. Johnson's bipartisan aims included inviting Vice President Nixon to spend the night at his ranch in Texas and attend a fundraising dinner where Nixon promised to not endorse the Republican candidates in the state nor speak negatively of Johnson. Dalek writes that Johnson's attraction to bipartisanship rested on personal preference and shrewd political judgments, and that bipartisanship went far to give both the Democrats control of Congress and open the door to Johnson's ascension as Majority Leader.